man he called the Eternal Comandante. In Maduro's short time as president, there had been waves of protest. The economy had begun to contract, inflation was soaring, and shortages of food and other goods were becoming acute. The word Mene, in the name of the town Mene Grande, comes from an indigenous word for oil seep, a place where oil bubbles up naturally from the earth. That is typical of Venezuela's oil. It is so close to the surface in many places that it seeps out of the ground on its own. Or you poke a hole and out it comes, like the opening credit scene in The Beverly Hillbillies, when Jed Clampett shoots at a varmint and misses, striking oil instead. Mene Grande has numerous oil seeps. The oil surges up, and over time it congeals and becomes a mound of something like tar or asphalt. Behind the tricolor park with the first oil well was a barrio, tumbling down the back of the hill, where people lived in hovels. Wandering around the barrio, I came upon a woman who was probably in her 30s or 40s, but she looked twice that age. Her bones showed under the skin of her arms. She wore a house dress so threadbare that it was almost sheer, and whatever color it once had was gone. She seemed faded, too, in the white-hot sun, bleached instead of burnt or tanned. She lived in one of the worst hovels I'd seen in Venezuela or anywhere else, a teetering collection of corrugated metal, cardboard, and wood. The most striking thing of all was that it had been assembled on top of a mene. Shiny slicks of oil stained the earth all around. To keep themselves out of the muck, the woman and her family had built up a kind of midden, maybe 3 feet high, from chunks of hardened oil residue and debris. It was like a big, broad pitcher's mound with a shack on top. Using a rectangular metal can for a stool, she sat in front of her hovel, on top of this mound of oil in its various states of coagulation, spooning rice and beans from a tin plate into her mouth. She told me that her name was Ismara Barrios. She lived there with her husband, 3 daughters, and a cousin. Her husband sold soft drinks and fried plantains in town. The sun was a hammer. I stood on the spongy ground between puddles of oil and squinted up at her. I tried to strike up a conversation. Venezuela was a country of extroverts, but Ismara cut against the grain. She seemed mistrustful of a stranger asking questions. "Things are going really well for me here," she said, as though wary that someone might suggest otherwise. I asked what she thought about the government. She told me that the government gave people what they needed. This was a Venezuelan truism, whether or not it was true in practice. Venezuela was a petrostate, and in the eyes of its citizens, it existed to parcel out the riches pumped from the ground. What did she think about Chavez? She said that he was her comandante. And Maduro? The son of the comandante. That was all. As Ismara and I spoke in September 2014, the country was poised on a fulcrum, like a pump jack about to tip downward from the top of its cycle. For most of the year, oil prices had been close to $100 a barrel, continuing a historic run of high prices. But now the price had begun to fall. By January, oil would have lost half its value, spelling disaster for Venezuela, which depended almost entirely on oil exports for its economic survival. I lived in Venezuela from 2012 to 2016, when I was the Andes region correspondent for the New York Times. After my stint as correspondent was over, I kept returning to Venezuela, sometimes to cover the news and sometimes to visit friends. I was back in 2018 to report on Maduro's re-election in a tainted vote. To ensure his victory, the government had barred most opposition parties from running a candidate against him. I returned again the following year after a young opposition legislator named Juan Guaido, recently chosen to lead the National Assembly, mounted a challenge to Maduro by declaring himself interim president with the support of the United States and dozens of other countries. By then, Venezuela had slipped.